Welcome back to Unsolicited Advice from Toxic Bubblegum. I'm Bubblegum.
I'm Toxic.
And this week we're talking about... Kat, you introduced it because you're the one that came up with it.
We're talking about structure, and structure is a very complex storytelling aspect that we're going to talk about more than once throughout the course of this podcast, but today we're just going to do, like, very basic structure things. Structural
Like, it's going to be the basis
pointers
for the rest of the structure that we talk about in the future.
Yeah.
Because as it turns out, you need to know how to do the basics of doing it before you can move on to the more advanced.
And when in the future we record those, I'll try to remember to come back and put links to the future things in there if you want to follow it all the way through.
We'll see what happens.
But right now we're just doing basics and spreading out. So, yeah.
So yeah, we have a quote.
I do have a quote. It's, my style of writing is to allow the story to unfold on its own. I try not to structure my work too rigidly.
That's by Anita Desai.
Yeah. Well, spreading out in terms of quotes we use also.
Right.
But I thought that would be a good one because it doesn't focus too much on any individual aspect of structure. It's very open, which kind of goes with what we're talking about today.
Right. So, do we have any notes or are we just sort of winging it?
Yeah, we're kind of winging it.
Woohoo! Wing!
I think it's going to be broken up the same.
Yeah, so
our
3
usual
parts.
ones are.
So usual.
Yeah. But then, like, we don't have any specific notes for what goes on those parts.
Alright. Well, I guess let's start. I'm going to default to you since I'm the artist. You do more structure than I do.
Yes. So, part 1, just is structure. What is structure? And that's pretty much, basically what we're going to be talking about today in terms of basics is just what kind of fundamentals your story should have, and go over, like, a couple basic structures that you can use that are pretty open.
Right. We have a couple of structure outlines in our resources pages already. Like, we have a freeform one, we have the 5-act Shakespearean structure.
Yeah.
There's just a beginning, middle, and end one.
And that's a good segue, because if you don't do a lot of outline, or if you don't want to plan going in, that's fine. I'm a big believer in rough drafts being kind of just, like, starting at a point and seeing where it evolves naturally. But a couple basic ideas of what a story should have, what an entire narrative should have in, like, 95% of all cases is a beginning, middle, end, or if you want to go a little bit less structured even than that, a conflict and a resolution.
Right.
And those are things that you should strive for because in terms of storytelling, they are very fundamental. They are things that you want to, that your audience is going to want to see for something to feel complete.
Right, because by having a resolution to your conflict, it ends things. I guess one of the things we could talk about in that sense is Infinity War. We get to talk about media because that movie definitely just ends.
Yeah, it's something that I do definitely want to touch on
when we get
in part 2
to that, because wow, that
I actually wanted to talk about
ends so fast.
I actually wanted to do a structure podcast the week that Infinity War came out, just because it does have a very unique approach to structure.
Right.
But we'll get to that in the media thing. I think basically it's, and one of the reasons why we're doing this in multiple episodes is because there are so many different ways that you can approach it.
Right.
And it really needs to, you should, and I guess this doesn't always apply to rough drafts, especially if you're someone who doesn't plan or outline or know exactly what you want to accomplish going in. But when you're working on a product that you know is going to be completely polished at some point, you should have a basic idea of what the structure should be, because it's something that can really help you it's something that can really help you tell your story and highlight the aspects that you want to shine through.
Right.
It's something that, and one of the main reasons we're talking about it today is because it's also something that should complement your format.
Right.
You should know you should have a basic idea of what you want the final product to be like. If you're writing something, and this is just like a very broad example, but if you're writing a project like for if you want to do like a comic, but you structure it like a traditional novel, or you write it like in the form of a play, it's not going to translate as well.
Right, because there are specific ways things need to be written, like, for comics. It's like how, like, if you're going into any sort of English major, or if you're, like, studying creative writing as a thing, like, you take different classes based on what you're you want your writing to be.
Right.
So, like, playwrights have a different way of approaching it than novelists do. I've taken a couple writing classes for comics specifically, and that's way different than, like, other stuff, and so it's, like, everything sort of has its own general structure, but then, like, of course you can mess around with it once you know that.
Yeah, if you change your mind, the story definitely can be altered later on. You can adapt stuff, and it's okay, but I think if you changed partway through a draft, it would be obvious that you
definitely
had intended the structure to be something different than what it ends up being.
Right.
Which is why we have multiple drafts of things, because, you know...
Right, because it's unlikely that you're gonna hit all of the marks you want to hit on that first draft. It's very unlikely.
Right.
But, I mean, sometimes you, but so that's how some people do things, I guess. But, yeah.
So, yeah, that's part one. Those are kind of the basic aspects that we're going to be tackling today. We're going to keep it fairly broad. The media segment, obviously, is going to get a little bit more detailed because we have specific examples of things.
Right.
But, overall, that's it. So,
it's going to be good.
Media segment.
Yeah, so...
do you want to start with Infinity War? Because we already brought it up.
So Infinity War was definitely a movie that felt like it just ended. I've seen it twice now. You've seen it more than twice now.
Yeah.
And it's like, every time, like, I see the ending, it just ends. But what Kat pointed out is that if you're following it from Thanos' point of view, it actually does have a complete storyline. It has a beginning, middle, and end for Thanos, specifically.
Yeah.
Whereas for the heroes, it has a beginning and, like, half of a middle.
And it's something I think we talked about a little bit in the Infinity War special that we did, because it does feel like the first, 2/3 of a standard Marvel movie structure.
Right.
But being the first half of a two-part story. But, again, if you look at it from Thanos' point of view, it is a complete story, because he completes his objective.
Right. It's like, because he has that,
I want to see the sun
set
on a grateful world.
And that's what he does at the end of the movie. It's like, God, I hate you so much. God. But yeah, so that's like, it's an interesting way of doing it, because they do have so much story to do,
and it is something that I think gives it more rewatch value, is because the first 2 times I saw it, I was somewhat underwhelmed, because I thought, this is like, so far it's following a Marvel formula. So far I've called all the shots. I wasn't surprised. It was a lot of exposition for not a lot of payoff, and I had a lot of complaints about the structure. But I think to have all of that set up an exposition for your protagonist while telling a complete arc for your antagonist, that's something we don't see a lot.
Oh, yeah,
I don't think I've ever seen that on that kind of scale.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it like that either.
Third time I watched it, I walked out of the theater more impressed than I had been the first 2 times.
Right, it's like, they did have a thing they were doing specifically. It didn't just end.
And it's also really interesting to have, your basic conflict resolution arc as a background story.
Right.
Which is what happens when you have the arc for someone who isn't your main cast. And I thought that was really... Yeah, Infinity War, structurally, is one of the most fascinating movies I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's very interesting with that. But yeah, so... I think Infinity War has a very interesting structure, just because it does have... It's telling 2 stories that are going at completely different paces.
And that's something... it's something that I kind of predict for trends coming up in more mainstream fantasy, is that now that we've seen that that can work and it can be successful and it can break box office records, I think we're going to see a lot more of complete arcs being told outside of the main focus. It's something that I hope that we see, but it's something to consider when you're working on a project too, is because that is some out of the box thinking. Like, you have that complete, it might not be as satisfying right away if people aren't paying attention, but having a complete arc done in a way that isn't as formulaic, that isn't in the foreground, is really interesting, and it's something to consider when you're working on a project.
Right, especially if you're doing something long, like Infinity War, like, it's definitely something, like, you have to consider is, like, how to keep the intrigue going through a very long story.
Right.
Because I don't make it through a lot of long stories. I'm like really bad. I have a really low attention span, as it turns out.
And this also was not anything that I was planning on talking about today. But while we're at it, let's talk about like the curse of middle installments of trilogies.
Oh God, yeah.
Because I think that's a big reason why. Well, I shouldn't guess why you don't make it through big stories, but I'm going to anyway. Well, I would guess that's one of the big reasons why you don't make it through, like,
probably
bigger stories, because there's always, like,
the lull in the middle.
The lull right in the middle that's, like, a transitional. There's, like, the walking book in the middle of Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. It's like what keeps me from going back and watching Lord of the Rings is they're very long movies, and also the Two Towers is in the middle of it. So...
Right. And I feel like any kind of installation like that, any series that has installations is going to have a slow point at some point. I do feel like middle ones are usually the case, like, for trilogies, but even in longer series, there's always one that's, like, the odd one out.
Order of the Phoenix.
It's really slow. See, I wouldn't even say Order of the Phoenix.
I wouldn't say it's particularly slow. I think because it's boring.
It's infuriating. I have a lot to say about Order of the Phoenix. I would say that Azkaban was objectively a lot more boring.
Yeah, that's true.
In terms of just, like...
especially the movie. Oh God, I don't even remember half of it.
6 out of the 7 books focus on Lord Voldemort and the Horcruxes and, like, overcoming evil. And then, like, Prisoner of Azkaban in the middle of that is, like, a jailbreak book. Right. It's really awkward and... like, a big time travel thing that they barely come back around to in Order of the Phoenix.
Oh God, Order of the Phoenix. It's weird because objectively, Azkaban has less going for it, event-wise, but I still literally have not made it through Order of the Phoenix. I've never watched it and made it all the way through.
I would say Order of the Phoenix is... structural. Now we're just going to talk about Harry Potter.
Oh no!
Welcome to our Harry Potter complaint podcast.
There's a lot.
The reason why I have, because I've reread the books several times, I've rewatched the movies several times. I've seen / read Order of the Phoenix less than any of the other ones, but it's because it's emotionally stressful for me. Like, it's fatiguing to make it through Order of the Phoenix, and it's not necessarily because it's, like, long or boring or transitional. It makes me so mad, like, being that angry. And I think it's like in the book more so than the movie. It's because it was well done.
Yeah.
But it was covering topics that you don't really want to dwell on.
Right.
There's like an Umbridge, because there's that thing going around where it's like more people have, like, an outright hatred for Umbridge than Voldemort, and it's not because Umbridge is a worse person, it's because she, like, epitomizes something that almost all people have had to deal with.
Right.
And it's frustrating, and, like, we read, like, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix came out not long before we had a principal who was uncannily like Umbridge.
It was, the Mad Ox, we used to call her.
And,
very subtle.
Yeah. But she, but yeah, and that's one of the big reasons, because it's like, looking back and reading Order of the Phoenix reminds me of that time when I was that frustrated and I felt oppressed as a child in a school setting. And
right.
it's like,
oh, God, man. Oh, that was fucking...
some of the worst years of my school career.
Fucking 6th
And I
through
don't like
8th
thinking
grade
about
was a
it.
goddamn nightmare with her running. Why would you become a principal if you hate children?
Why would you become a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher if you hate children? It's
Why would anyone?
It was frighteningly applicable.
Yeah, she looked like her too. That's the other thing.
Oh god,
Is
yeah.
she looked exactly like her.
They cast someone who looked exactly like our principal, and I was like, oh my god.
Yeah, Oh, wow.
So structurally, I'd say that was like a different thing, but Prisoner of Azkaban, I would say, is that lull book still.
Right.
Because it didn't apply very much. And it's one of those things, like, obviously, there were important plot developments
Right,
that
I mean,
happened in Azkaban.
Sirius was there.
That's where they introduced Sirius Black. That's where they introduced the concept of time turners, which obviously comes back around and is very important. The Patronuses come in at Prisoner of Azkaban. Dementors, the concept of Azkaban, and like there's a lot of good stuff in it, but in terms of like furthering the plot, it didn't really.
It's like
it just introduced stuff.
It's like the big exposition thing.
It's like the Harry Potter equivalent of the Two Towers.
God damn it!
And I think every book series kind of has one.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, because you kind of have to get into that point in the series where you have to like address things and like go back and explain some things, and it's like it's not always going to be the most exciting. Like it's just sort of an inevitability that something like, especially if you're like in a heavy action series, when like you're gonna have to go back and like explain a lot of stuff that's more exposition-y, like, than it is driving things forward. It definitely does feel very different. Like
it it's one thing that I really enjoy about the Hunger Games books is because which is another trilogy, but the transitional sort of lull one was actually the last one in the series.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's also your least favorite, as I recall. Mockingjay your least favorite?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it almost has to be. It's I like it more as an adult than I did as a kid, for sure, because it had a very mature resolution, and I was not very mature the first time that I read it.
Right.
I could not handle the resolution, but just from a storytelling structure, because it does feel slow when you start it.
Right.
There's a lot of exposition. It's very transitional. But I do appreciate the end a lot more now than I did the first time I read. I'm no longer as mad at Mockingjay as I used to be.
You used to be goddamn furious about it. I remember.
But it made it really interesting when it was adapted into the movies, because Mockingjay Part 1 was that transitional thing. So in the movies, we still ended on a completely strong, action-focused movie.
Right. Which I still haven't seen. I should do that. I should see Mockingjay Part 2.
It was better than Mockingjay Part 1. Although, it didn't have the catchy song.
Damn
so
it.
That sucks.
You can't win them all, I guess.
So yeah, that's some structure stuff.
Yeah.
I want to talk, and one of the reasons why we're doing it this week is because I want to talk about some stuff that came out this week.
Yeah.
And, I want to talk about Netflix. I'm mad at them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this week, on the 29th, we got season 5 of Arrested Development, and on the 30th, we got the 4th season of Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, both of which are shows that I'm big fans of. Arrested Development, I've been a fan of
forever.
Since, like, middle school, I think.
Right. Yeah, that sounds right.
I don't know when Arrested Development came out.
That sounds sort of correct.
But I know there was, like, an 8-year gap in between season 3 and 4, or whatever. And one of the big reasons that I want to talk about Arrested Development is because it's a great example of why you privately should play with things before you give them out to an audience.
Right.
Maybe? For those of you who don't know, Arrested Development was canceled after season 3. Netflix picked it up as what they are referring to as a Netflix semi-original series. And they funded to have season 4 made. So season 4 came out, and it did not follow a chronological timeline like the first 3 seasons had. It told this whole story from everyone's point of view. So like they kept going back to the beginning, and we'd fill in more of the timeline, more of the questions would be answered. It was really interesting, but it was really alienating to a lot of the audience.
Right.
That was used to a chronological story. And then they backtracked on that. They got a lot of feedback about how the story was very confusing. The first several episodes were not good because you were just so confused, and a lot of people didn't stick with it to get the whole story because they felt confused.
Right.
And were like, this is not Arrested Development. So they didn't do anything about that for years, and in preparation for season 5, they re-released Arrested. I think it was this January, February, early this year, they released what they called the season 4 remix, which was the entire story told chronologically with new narration. And then they got rid of the original season 4, replaced it with what they called season 4 Fateful Consequences, which was just a which was just like a retitling of their remix. And then they moved, and I did get this wrong when I was complaining about Arrested Development last week. They moved it to the special features, so you can still watch the original season 4.
Okay.
But it is now considered a bonus feature. They hid it. Like, no one will watch the bonus features. And then season 5 came out. It's 8 episodes, which is really short.
As opposed to the 20.
For Arrested Development. And it's bad.
Oh, no!
I'm not gonna give too much about the story, because I know it has just, recently come out, but it doesn't tie up... It ties back to the conflicts that weren't resolved in season 4, but there's another really weird time. There's a 3-month time gap in between the 2 seasons that's very poorly explained. And then it doesn't, it ties back to unresolved issues, but it does not resolve them. And then it adds new issues. So first of all, you're not as invested, but then when you make it to the end of the season and none of that's been resolved, you're like, what?
Did I watch this?
I did not know I was watching the season finale as I was watching it, because I expected there to be 12 more episodes.
Right.
And it ended, and I genuinely thought it was a mistake. Because, that's how bad the finale was.
Wow.
And I'm okay. I understand that seasons sometimes have to end on cliffhangers so that things can get renewed.
Right.
But it wasn't a bigger cliffhanger than any of the other ones in the season. I had no way of knowing that was the last episode until Netflix wanted me to watch something else, because it was out of Arrested Development. Which was really frustrating. Structurally, that was just a whole series of bad calls. So it's one of those things, if you're going to kibitz with a project, do it before you release it.
Right.
Don't try to, backpedal after. If you do try to backpedal, which, again, I wouldn't recommend, release an alternate version. Maybe don't try to just replace the version that you had.
Yeah, don't go and, hide the original version of it. That seems bad. Unless you really fucked up.
If you've ever had a show where you have to put the original season in the bonus features,
God,
it's probably bad. And the opposite side of that is that Kimmy Schmidt, very good structurally. I'm also mad about, because season 4 only had 6 seasons, which...
6 seasons?
6 seasons? Yes, 6 episodes. Season 4 had 6 episodes, and it's something that is infuriating, because the first 3 seasons all had, 13 episodes?
Yeah, that's what you said in the car.
So I still feel like they were cut short, but watching episode 6, it definitely felt like there was enough of a cliffhanger to get me excited about what had better be a renewed season of the show. But enough of the stories had been resolved that I did have closure, and that's like the ideal. That's what you want to have.
Right, your finale should feel like a finale.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't get renewed, you still need to end on something.
Right.
Like, it's like the fucking, what's the Sonic Saturday Morning, that one that infamously ends on a cliffhanger and then did not get renewed. It was like,
and if you have something like that where you are just like canceled unexpectedly, I think that's just, it's sad, it's heartbreaking, but it's something that if you are creative enough, you can have a lot of fun with.
Right.
My Name is Earl ended on a huge, in the first part of a 2-part episode. Got canceled. The second half of the episode was never made.
Oh no!
But the director of the show, his next show has like a bunch of tiebacks, and you never get the end to My Name is Earl when you watch Raising Hope, which was the next show. But they make a lot of fun about how you didn't get the end to my... So it's one of those things, you'd probably miss it if you never watched My Name is Earl, but they have like a lot of things where it's like, this guy named Earl was in the news and you'll never believe how his story was resolved. And there's just a lot of background stuff like that where...
God.
So that was fun.
I think it's also, Futurama had a lot of fun with making fun of Fox.
Avenge Us.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was fun. They, there's one of the Futurama movies they spend, I'm probably like a fifth of the time just making fun of the Fox executives for canceling them.
That's fair. Well, maybe if they would stop canceling all their good shows, it'd be fine, but...
They never will.
They never will.
And that's also, since we're talking about it, about Fox canceling shows, you can also renew your show in the form of a movie, like Firefly and Serenity.
Right, and it's like, because even though, like, Firefly sort of ended, I don't super remember.
Firefly ended with Objects in Space, which was the one with Jubal early.
Oh, God.
It just, like, goes around wandering the ship.
But yeah, so it's like, you can get a better end for yourself. And a lot of that is, like, fans pitching in, too. Like, a lot of fan campaigns, like, will really push for things to be remade in whatever way they can scrap it together.
And, yeah, so it's like one of those things, sometimes you can't plan, you have to have a good enough concept of your structure going in that it's consistent if you get the time that you need or want, but you have to be able to improvise enough that if something happens, like a cancellation or someone drops out of the project, if you have to stop your story early, you need to be able to wrap it up.
Let's talk about the opposite thing with How I Met Your Mother. They got an extra season.
And it shows. It shows that that was not supposed to be part of the thing. Or Scrubs.
Oh, God.
I'm always complaining about Scrubs, med school.
Scrubs.
But, a lot of How I Met Your Mother fans were like, I guess How I Met Your Mother is better to talk about because Scrubs fans just pretended that there was not a 9th season of Scrubs, whereas How I Met Your Mother fans were really outraged by was it also 9 seasons? Was that season 9?
I thought it was,
or was that season 8?
I thought it was 8. I thought it was supposed to be 7 seasons, and then they gave them an extra one.
8?
Yeah.
I should maybe rewatch How I Met Your Mother. I haven't done it in a long time.
You like it?
I do like it. It's like one of my favorite shows. But yeah, the last season. And that, actually, the last season of How I Met Your Mother is a great example of bad structure in and of itself, because the first however many episodes take place over the course of a single weekend. It's everyone's point of view of the story over, like, a long weekend for 2 of the main characters to get married. But then the last episode, the final episode of How I Met Your Mother, was just... like, the last 20 years following that.
God!
It's like, if you're gonna follow that much time, you've gotta pace it out a little bit better.
Right, 20 years is a long time.
Because we were so used to the intricate storytelling. We know everything that happened to everyone that weekend. And then they completely negate everything. The couple gets divorced in the spoiler alert for How I Met Your Mother.
It's okay.
Two people who don't believe in marriage get married. Doesn't work well. They get divorced, like, 2 years later. So it's like, we spend the whole time working up to this wedding, and then immediately find out that the couple just gets divorced anyway.
So what was the point of the whole season?
And it just, like, keeps spiraling out after that, and it's like, oh, man.
Oh, why?
And it's like, you could argue, because from Ted Mosby's point of view, that is the weekend where he meets the mother. So you're like, obviously it's important, but because it had spent so much of... The other characters got to be important during How I Met Your Mother. Like, Ted Mosby, arguably, is the least liked of the cast.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And, so it's, like, one of those things where it's, like, even though it was resolving the big title story, we don't care that much.
Right.
We care about everybody else, and in terms of that, it was just bad.
Oh.
Bad structure. And you can't, and that's the worst thing is you can't even tell people to stop watching How I Met Your Mother a season early because he never meets the mother.
Right?
If you stop a season before. So you have to put up with the bad season.
And it's like, what?
Yeah.
God. So as it turns out, having too much time can also sort of mess with your structure.
Yeah.
Becomes very apparent if you don't have a team that can adapt to that kind of situation.
Yeah. Work with, if you personally are not an adaptable person, get some on your team.
Right.
Try to learn to be adaptable also. It's a good skill.
Right. The more you work with adaptable people, the more adaptable you'll become. So, but you can't just sort of get stuck because it's very obvious that you got stuck.
And, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, consistency is important in planning. Gonna talk real quick about Song of Ice and Fire.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, just with, like, really upsetting the structure like they did in Arrested Development, and I was mad about it. The first 3 Song of Ice and Fire books are all chronological. You get everything that's going on in the entire world, told through the perspectives of the main characters. And then the 4th and 5th book came out, and they didn't come out at the same time. I feel like this is important, because there was still, like a few years gap in between Feast of Crows and Dance of Dragons. But it's told, they both start and end at the same point, but it's broken up by region, which, when you follow a story, because even 4 looks chronological in comparison when, like, it follows the first 3. So, aside from cutting out characters that we love, like Daenerys, not in Feast for Crows.
God.
At all. Jon Snow, not in Feast for Crows.
You can just skip those books if you don't care about the other characters.
Right, and it's like, they cut out, like, half the cast for book 4, so book 4 sucked, but it's, like, still chronological, and then to go back after you've read straight through for 4,000+ page books, and then at 5 to go back to a random point at the beginning of book 4, and it was like, it's some of the worst structure I've ever seen. And they're both good books. I think they might be one of my favorite books if they had been done structurally the same as the other ones. And this is where I don't like calling out famous writers and or writers that I really like, but George R.R. Martin is always, he's like a big, I don't need outlines for stuff, and that's an instance where it might have helped.
Yeah, a little bit to have one there.
Yeah, because the whole thing was he didn't know how big the story was going to be, and he's like, it doesn't tell a complete resolution if I break it up chronologically in the middle, so I'm just going to break it up by region, which at that point kind of makes sense, but it was very, very disorienting for the audience.
Like, the audience, like, you can't, it's hard to just spring something new on your audience all at once.
Right.
And expect them to just, like, embrace it.
especially so far in.
Right, especially so far in. It's a long series.
And the show is kind of doing the same thing. The last 2 seasons of the show, we've gotten very accustomed to the structure in the first 6 seasons. In the first 5 seasons, they all follow more or less the same structure, and we got kind of used to that. And then the last 2 seasons, what we're doing, we're not getting a full 10-episode season anymore.
Yeah.
We're getting a 6-episode season and a 7-episode season.
God, so much.
It's like, and you could tell, with
definitely.
the short season, that the structure felt really off from what we had gotten accustomed to.
Yeah, it was rough. I mean, like, season 5 is by far the worst season, like, hands down. But, like, season 6 did feel very different. Disorienting.
It felt very rushed.
Right.
Because we're missing 4 episodes from the, 3 episode from the season.
Right.
I forgot which order they went in. And it shows, because we had gotten so used to the 10-episode structure.
Right. And then, like, I understand they wanted to switch it up because they wanted, like, more equal episodes. I don't know why they did it, actually. I think they just wanted to fuck with us.
I think it was because Game of Thrones, it was one of those things where it's like, we need 13 episodes to tell a story. Let's, instead of giving one long season, let's draw it out.
Gotta keep that cash flow coming.
Which, I guess I don't mind, because it's paying for Last Week Tonight.
Yeah, okay. That's fine.
So, like, I'll take it, but I'm mad.
I'm upset about it, but it's fine.
And, yeah. Do you want to talk about Mouse?
I do want to talk about Mouse.
And the mouse structure?
Actually, Mouse is, I really like it. So it's an example of, I think this is the first example of, no, because How I Met Your Mother is technically also a framed story.
Technically, yes.
Technically, but it doesn't really care about it. Mouse is a story that cares about its frame structure.
Yes.
Because it's, what the technical story of Mouse is, it's Art Spiegelman interviewing his father about his experiences during the Holocaust and the way everything has affected his father now, where Art is taking care of him in the present. So, that's the technical story, which factors in at multiple points. Like, we go back to it at multiple times to see what they're dealing with, seeing how present day is like, seeing what Art's experience writing the book is like, and it cares about that a lot. But everything, so that's told chronologically, and so is the story of his father, because it's like, basically he had transcripts of it, or audio recordings of it, and almost all the narration from his father is word for word in there.
Which is very powerful.
Oh, God. Well, it was even, I remember when I saw it at the Jewish Heritage Museum, because it's like, they had all the drafts on the walls, and then they had the actual audio recording playing.
Yeah.
It was so powerful. It was, oh my God.
Yeah, just as a side note, if you can get to those audio, like, if you can ever have the opportunity to listen to the audio recording.
Right. I think if you get the MetaMouse, because I think that comes with a CD that has the audio recordings on it, and it's a whole other level of depth to it. But yeah, so it's like, it's 2 chronological stories that are being told at the same time. And I remember, because I talked to my dad about it, and he was like, at first he thought the frame story was a bit distracting, but by the end of it, he was, like, totally on board with it.
Right.
Because it's, like, as you really learn about Vladik's past and everything, you can become more invested in him as who he is now in the future.
Yeah.
Also. So it's, like, Mouse just, I love Mouse so much.
Mouse is so good.
As I say every other time I talk about Mouse, please read Mouse. It is so good.
It is it's one of those things where it's like, if any kind of literary place recommends a single graphic novel, it's always Mouse.
I mean, there's a big reason it is, like, the cornerstone of graphic novels.
Yeah.
Like, it's the reason that so many of them are where they are now, and they get the kind of respect they do now, because that was not the case when it was being published. It was, because I remember, because he was, when he was talking about doing it, he was like, you draw cartoons, no one's gonna want to read this. No one's going to want to read something so serious. Nobody wants to read anything about the Holocaust. Like, that was one of the things his dad said, and it was like, well, clearly they do, when it's done so well.
And the other thing I will say, if you do like reading about the Holocaust, if you do like World War II novels, everyone should read Mouse.
Yeah,
but
honestly.
It's one of those things where it's like, I think I put off reading Mouse for a long time, because I did not think that it was a topic that was going to translate well to a visual format, and I was wrong. I was dumb. It's one of the most poignant World War II books that you can read.
I would, like, honestly, because we started learning about it, like, in middle school or whatever. Yeah. I hated it whenever we had to cover it in middle school, because the material they gave us was pretty bad. Like, there were some good books, but I feel like some of them were too intense. Like, yeah. I do not think a child should be reading Night. I think Night should be saved for high schoolers.
Yeah, absolutely.
But because Mouse has an ability to distance itself through the fact that it's comics, I think it's a much better fit for, like, middle schoolers going into high school.
If I had read Mouse in middle school...
it would have been...
I would have paid attention during the Holocaust units.
Right, I would have been so much more, intrigued by it. But the thing is, it touches on, the topics in school that they don't want us to cover, which is anything that is not European.
Right.
So, you know.
That's also true.
Yeah. It doesn't... I think it's because it doesn't get used in schools because it does sort of touch on... Because one of the things, like, they touch on is that, at one point, there's, like, a black man that comes by, and Vladek is racist about it. And, like, it's one of the things that they have to confront is that even though he's been through all of this, he still has his own prejudices like that. And it's like, so it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it's because they don't want to get on that level.
But even, I guess that makes sense. I still think maybe it should be, like, segments of it.
Oh, I absolutely believe it
something should be incorporated. I think it's always wondered, just as, like, a side, I've always wondered why they don't teach Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And I know...
that would be too nice to us?
I think it's one of those things where it's, like, it's really sad, because The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is fiction. It's World War II fiction, and it's not historically accurate to the layout of the camps, which I'm assuming is one of the big reasons why it's not taught more. But John Boyne, like, one of the things was he wanted a dramatization told from the point of view of someone younger, so that as a transitional material into going into learning about the Holocaust. And it's one of those things where it's like, it's a powerful story, and I think teaching that at the beginning of Holocaust units...
Oh, absolutely. There's no reason we should be reading Night and not Boy in the Striped Pajamas, because it just... And there's also no reason we should read Night in middle school and then read All But My Life in all my life.
Oh my god.
Oh, wow. We're bringing up a lot of middle school trauma.
I'm also, I didn't know we were going to be talking about House today. Mouse? House? I didn't know we were going to be talking about House today. My favorite graphic novel, House. I didn't know we were going to be talking about Mouse. I just, like, earlier this week, on Memorial Day, I watched Imitation Game with my family. So I have, like, the World War II stuff is just on my mind this week.
Right? Speaking of...
structuring, if you're structuring a class, ease children into the topic of World War II.
Because as it turns out, like, it's one of those things, it was always so jarring for me. And it was, like, one of those things where it's like, I didn't want to learn about it, because it was like, especially because it was not in history class, it was in English class.
Yeah.
So it was just like, and it didn't help that we had to do it every year in middle school also.
World War II is such an interesting topic, but when they teach it in school, they really beat it into you without giving you an understanding of how bad it was.
Right.
Like, they just desensitize you to the topic.
Exactly. It was like one of those things where it was like, by the time we were covering it, again, I was like, yeah, I know. I get it. I didn't get it. Until I read something like Mouse.
Like Mouse.
That was, like, really, like,
it's one
caught you.
Thing that I, like, really appreciated. I don't think I'd read World War II stuff anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If I had the last Holocaust unit I ever did, my teacher was like, I understand that by this point in your school,
Mm-hmm.
in your education, you've had to study this. It was like the 6th year consecutively we'd had a Holocaust unit, and my teacher was like, so we're gonna cover the basics real fast in the first day of the Holocaust unit. These are the things you need to know for the test. But then, like, for the 2 weeks after that, she let us study different areas of what was going on in World War II. So it was like we could choose anything that was going on in history to read about going on during that time. And it, like, really helped because I learned a lot of stuff that was really just fascinating about what was going on at the time.
Right, because as it turns out, there was more going on.
Yeah.
Because another thing, I mean, this is getting off the structure topic and going into the education topic of just American education is bad. Like, public education is bad.
It's really bad.
So, like, but yeah, so it was, like, one of those things where it's, like, I am really glad that, like, I did pick up Mouse and get to read it and, like, really get a better understanding of the whole thing. Because as it turns out, I think the visuals are also a big part of it. Because even though it is very done in a more simple style, seeing it is a lot different than reading it. Like,
absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's Mouse.
Yeah.
I love Mouse.
In the topic of framing stuff, also in framing sad stories.
Oh no!
I also just recently have read Kite Runner, and it's another one where it tells the story on 2 different timelines. I think that's a really effective way to tell personal narratives.
Right.
Like Mouse. Like the Kite Runner. It's an effective, like, if you can pull it off, it's really good.
Right. It's like one of those things where you have to have a very good idea of balancing it and making sure everything complements each other, but when it works, it really works.
Yeah. And it, especially, like, in Kite running only happens at, like, 2 points in the story, and lining those 2 points up to be on either side of the narrative was just, it was effective. It was good.
Right. The mirror effect.
Yeah. And the last thing that I want to touch on for the media segment is just kind of a good example of why, because platform is also a big consideration when you're structuring your story, which is something we kind of touched on. It's like the big difference between Handmaid's Tale and Game of Thrones is because they were both, looking at the early seasons, they're structured very similarly. But the first year that HBO did streaming, it was a disaster because HBO obviously, like, now you can stream everything from HBO, but when it started, HBO was a channel. It was like a traditional cable network in terms of platform, but it was trying to transition into an online format with their most popular show, and what that resulted in is a brand new app that they released the month before crashing every week at the same time.
God,
like, whereas Handmaid's Tale, very popular show, but it was made for a streaming site.
Right.
And it's like the platform was taken into consideration. It could handle what they were trying to do. And that has less to do, I guess, with story structure and just more with how you put your work out there.
Right.
But it's something that, like, and I'm a little bit biased because the year that they came out with the HBO app happened to be the worst season of Game of Thrones anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
But I have so many negative connotations with that season just from trying to watch it in a platform where it wasn't working. And it's like, Yeah, how things are presented will leave an impact with the audience, even with an aware audience. Like, I know that's part of my distaste, especially for the first, like, 4 episodes of that season.
Oh.
But it's like, it was so frustrating. And I remember that. Like, I still feel aggravated using the HBO app sometimes.
Yeah, it's like you just log in and it's like, oh, God, this shit again.
And I feel that frustration when I watch season 5 of Game of Thrones. Not that I do a lot. I tend to, like... If I'm watching by myself, I don't always watch season 5.
Because it's bad. Because it's literally the worst. Everything's unnecessary and bad.
And, like, when you have a fluid platform that works well, like, I can focus on the narrative of Handmaid's Tale.
Right.
It's horrifying, and sometimes I don't want to, but it works on the platform, and that's, like, really...
Right.
I think the big exception to this is if you really are breaking platform boundaries. The big example of that, obviously, being Dr. Horrible.
Right, which
like,
was
the site also crashed repeatedly when Dr. Horrible was launched because it couldn't handle the traffic, but it was the first thing like Dr. Horrible that had ever been done.
Right. So it was understandable that they wouldn't be prepared for it.
Right.
Because you can't... It's hard to be prepared for the unknown.
HBO could have prepared. They had several months to launch.
Yeah, they could have had so much time to adjust and see what was going on. But
and they knew how many people were watching Game of Thrones at that point.
Right.
They should have known and prepared for that much traffic. Dr. Horrible, the creators were so baffled by how many people signed on to watch that first day.
Right?
So it's it is more forgivable there, I feel like.
Yeah. It's more forgivable when you're an upstart thing. When you're an upstart indie project, obviously you have less QA than a multi-million-dollar company does.
Yeah.
That's just how things work sometimes.
And it's also, especially, in the early days of YouTube shows, that was something where it was there was a lot of trial and error being figured out because YouTube as a storytelling platform was new.
Right.
Know? It's that's a whole different kind of thing for people to learn.
Right. So it's it makes sense in the early times that things are a little rougher, but at the point where things are more developed, people expect a higher quality of content.
Yeah.
Than,
And it's something where it's even though the, execution worked very differently between HBO and Hulu, those are both platforms that are accepting of darker, longer, more involved things. It's definitely not something that I would suggest for... I wouldn't suggest a tone of story like that to be broken up for something that's, exclusively going to be on YouTube.
Right.
I also am not quite sure, I feel because Netflix is also doing, weekly things now. Which a weekly format, a weekly structured format for talk shows or any kind of topical comedy... I'm talking about Break, mostly, with Michelle Wolf. Or the, what's-his-face McHale show, the Community dude. I don't know what his name is. Joel? Is it Joel?
I don't know.
Joel McHale? Anyway.
I have no idea.
He has a show on Netflix also, and it's weekly, and it's Netflix is just trying to compete, and I understand that, but right now, the weekly episode format is really awkward.
Yeah,
because it's Netflix.
Because Netflix is so used to releasing everything all at once, and that's what the Netflix audience expects.
Yeah,
which is why it's so jarring when they change it. It's changing your format without really giving your audience time to adjust.
Exactly.
You're springing it, Yeah. It's I don't like that, actually. Part of the reason I watch Netflix is so I can binge shit.
Exactly. And it's so I feel the Netflix audience just generally is going to be less receptive to weekly installments. And it's one of the big reasons, I don't think Netflix could have pulled off something quite like Handmaid's Tale.
Right.
Because Hulu is more suitable to the weekly installation things than Netflix.
Right.
But again, like, with the talk shows and stuff, like, you can't have a topical thing that gets released the year after it's made.
Right, that's just not how it works.
But I hope that they find a better way of transitioning the audience. Like, I hope that it's worth it in the long run for them.
Right.
It's
like,
bad right now.
Hopefully they're using this as, like, a learning curve. I wish they didn't do it on their mass audience.
Yeah.
But, like, I hope they will develop something that works.
And it's like, I am trying even to get on board with it, because some of the shows are pretty good, but it is really frustrating, because even, like, trying to find where I'm at in shows, there's, like, no system to find out what the new stuff is, other than just knowing which shows are being put out weekly and remembering to check them every week from your, like, continue watching.
Right. Oh, God,
it's
yeah, I
obnoxious.
don't remember to do that ever. Like, I can't even keep up with shows that I'm watching right now that are all released.
Yeah. It's also something, this is topical in YouTube news also, I guess. Because YouTube is also experimenting. They're changing the subscriptions page, which is the only page like that where you can get the notifications. And there was a lot of backlash for it, where everyone was like, this is a bad idea, don't do it. And YouTube's like, it's an optional function, it's an experiment, but it's like, you know it's happening because they're going to transition to that.
Right, it's like, and also, they were like, it's optional, except you are automatically opt-in to it. You can't go back and change it. Like, you have to, like, even if you hit the notify bell now, it doesn't matter. You don't always get all the notifications.
You don't always get all the notifications. There's no single page where you can just see all of the content that you're subscribed to in the order that it came out.
Right.
It's like, that is so bad.
It's like, why are you doing this? YouTube, please.
Like, it doesn't work with the platform. And I feel like it's going to be really difficult for people who have any kind of YouTube content that's sequential.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's also a problem, like, I think YouTube has sort of a bad way of dealing with sequential content as is, because when you make a playlist, it puts it together newest to oldest.
Yeah.
And it's like, so you have to go in and, like, manually
move everything.
Adjust.
It's hard for it's one of those things where it's like, and again, when you're choosing a platform, you have to take these things into considerations, because the platforms are not always going to do things in a way that makes sense for creators.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know what you're getting into and, like, plan for it.
Right, you need to have an understanding of the media you're uploading to before you do it, because as it turns out, if you don't know what you're doing, it's gonna show.
Yeah.
But
this is, like, a nice, non-linear story thing. It's not that. We don't have to worry about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the other things, my last thing for the media segment is I'm going to talk about Hetalia real fast, because I've been looking at it. And it's like, Hetalia is, like, or any, like, Pop Team Epic, or any sort of those 4-panel comics, which is, really, specifically, it's, like, a Japanese, originated method of just telling, like, quick comics. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with how it works, it's from top to bottom, and it's just 4 panels, and it tells a complete, it's usually used for, like, jokes. Like, it's sort of like an American comic strip, only it's done just in those 4 pages, all the same size, like, and, like, Hetalia is, like, I think it's still being published. I don't really follow it anymore, but, like, it has a very good way of, because its story is non-linear, because it sort of jumps around in history, but, like, all of the 4 panels, like, tell a consecutive exact joke, and it's, like, it's very good, as it turns out. I have a very soft spot in my heart for Hetalia.
Structurally, it's very interesting. I never made it very far into Hetalia, but yeah.
Yeah. It's like, so it has, like, an interesting structure, because it's, like, it'll have recurring segments, but they won't always be grouped together when they're published. Like, sometimes it'll have more sort of spread out stuff, or sometimes it'll all come at once. And sometimes it does go into the more traditional comic style, but a lot of the time it's just the 4 panels, and I think it does a real good job of, like, sort of spreading things out. It's really confusing if you just watch the anime first, because it doesn't make sense.
That's also true.
So it's really one of those things that is, like, you gotta figure out what's going on. Like, you have to sort of have an idea of it going in to understand what's happening, because that's definitely not what happened when I started it the first time.
Yeah.
And I was very confused, and it took me a couple years to come back around to it.
That's like a thing, with, because, Aaron will watch just about any anime.
Right.
Ever, quit 2 episodes into Hetalia, was like,
damn,
never again. So, and I have not recommended an anime since then. Residual guilt.
Residual guilt.
Uh,
It's okay. Just recommend, like, you know, Elfen Lied. That's a good, happy anime. Nothing bad happens
he
there.
actually recommended that to me.
Oh, no.
So,
did you watch it?
I did, yeah.
Oh, nothing bad or sad happens there. I can't watch it because there's animal death, and I can't deal with that.
That's the worst thing about it.
Like, I was fighting, like, I saw it on, like, a Watch Mojo list, and I was like, I can't do this. I literally can't watch this anime ever, as it turns out. But yeah.
And it's got an interesting structure. No, it's fine. The structure is fine.
It's fine. It's anime.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's our media segment.
Yeah, that's lots of media things
And
we said and complained about.
So I guess for part 3, we're just, because we were giving advice throughout part 3, just kind of recap that a little bit.
Yeah.
Planning never hurts.
Right.
When you're working on a polished piece. Especially, and, like, even if you do rough drafts, even if you do, like, blind drafts, I guess, like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a good idea. It's a great starting point, but if structure is something that you struggle with, an outline after the rough draft can be really useful in understanding how your audience is going to understand your story. It's something that I would recommend.
It's a good idea if you're having doubts about your structure to also have someone else take a look at it.
Oh, yeah.
Like, ideally someone who's not familiar with your work, so it's like someone who would be reading your stuff for the first time, but also, like, you probably don't just want to pick someone off the street. You want someone who, like, you trust to give you good feedback, or you're paying to give you good feedback, and has an idea of, you know, these concepts that are at work.
Right.
So
it's something that I recommend getting. If you have any kind of friend group that is more perceptive when it comes to, like, storytelling, that's something that's good. Try to find people who enjoy the things that you're aiming for.
Right.
It's something that we kind of talked about, like, when getting feedback anyway, but it really helps with structure, I feel like.
Right, absolutely.
So yeah, that's a really good way to go about that. Choose structures for your platform, plan roughly with the, leave yourself enough room to change stuff, and I think, especially, like, if you're working on a project with other people, it's good. This is another instance where outline would be really good.
Right.
Because if you're working on something with someone else and you all have different concepts of where it's going to end up, like, you might be structuring something that's incorrect.
Right. You need to, like, come to a solid, this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
Before setting anything in stone. Because as it turns out, that can be bad.
That can be really bad. It's also something, like, with the collaboration that we're working on right now, it's a really tough thing, because especially when you're doing something that's out of your comfort zone or something just very new, it's going to be, you're going to have to make big changes and play with stuff, because that's how it works, and it can be really hard to communicate after the fact when you don't know what you're doing exactly. And I got in for, like, because we're adapting the Stupid Expert podcast, we're doing adventures into a book, and I structured it to be, the entire podcast to be one book, so that I could win a word count award for NaNoWriMo. No regrets. But
then
it was really hard to see past that structure later on, and it was difficult. It's hard to communicate with other people,
right,
I guess. This is, like, the biggest collaboration I've done.
Right.
That I haven't been paid for, and there are, like, a lot of new things going on.
Right.
I have a tough time with the adventures book sometimes.
Is it because Ben is a bad man?
It's because it's long. It's because the rough draft won me a word count award.
That's fair!
But yeah.
But now it's multiple books.
It is. Because it made more sense for the structure. Even though, because it's adjusting platforms. It's one of those things where it's like, the original concept was to, because it was one arc, to make it one book. And it was fun. I had a good time working on it. It got me, like, a really cool merit badge that I am glad to have gotten. But it was, because we were switching platforms, changes had to be made.
Right.
Now we're working on, like, the new take on that, which I'm also excited about.
I know, it's going to be good. I'm excited about it. Adventures is good. One day we'll upload the rest of that podcast.
Never gonna happen.
God damn it. I'm sorry!
I ruined your podcast.
I'm so sorry!
So yeah. But structurally, it was really hard, because especially with gaming podcasts that are not pre-structured going in, adapting that into a traditionally structured thing.
Right. Making it look like everything was together from the start.
And this also is something I maybe should have talked about in the media segment instead of right here. But there's also, like, when you do novelizations of stuff, you can buy novelizations of all kinds of movies. And the structure is always so awkward. Because it has to follow, like, the writers who do that have to follow the events of the movie. But there's a reason why the movie was different from the original book.
Right.
The Cabin in the Woods novelization is, like, really bad.
God, why would they do that?
To kill me, maybe?
That's fair.
But it was, like, hard to read.
I don't blame you. I can't imagine.
Because it definitely was structured as a movie, and it was very reliant on a lot of visual
stuff.
Effects.
As it turns out.
Like, bouncing back and forth between the Foundation and the group of people was so bad in novel form.
Oh,
like,
God.
I didn't like it.
Should be easy. You should just need a couple of stars. Apparently not.
No. So.
Yeah.
Do you have any other structural advice?
Not really.
In terms of, like, basic structure?
Like, know what you're writing for. If you enjoy a particular piece of... If you see a trend in the stories that you like, study those. Study those. Because, like, if there's something you like about it, then that's probably something you'll want to try doing in your work. So it'll be of the same vein. Or if you don't like anything, just sort of wing it for a little bit and see how it comes out, you know?
And this is something that we'll probably talk about when we revisit structure with more specific examples of ways that you can do structure. But it's something, it can be broken up a lot by genre and subgenre. So it's important to not only know what you like, but what people invested in that genre are going to be expecting.
Right.
Because, like, if you're writing, I think horror and romance are two of the big ones that are structured very, very differently than, like, realistic fiction, nonfiction, or fantasy. Nonfiction tends to have really even pacing, which you need to know in the structure, whereas something like romance or horror, where there's, like, a big payoff at the end is going to be the shortest part of the book.
Right.
Which might not necessarily be the case for something else.
Right.
And again, that's just generally, it's not like every horror thing ever, or every romance thing ever. But that's a big reason why I think in romance there are so many tropes that we don't like because you have to wrap things up very quickly at the end.
Right, it has to be like, and we're done.
Because that's how people expect romance to be. So it's just good to know the market that you're writing for.
Right. Know your audience, know what you're going for, and go from there, more or less.
And focus on consistency, if you can.
Right. It's like, if you're an artist, you need to study basic anatomy before you can sort of go off on your own.
Yeah.
You know, like, you start with an anatomy book, you start with a basic structure, and then you build up your skills from there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's about it.
That's it.
Let's go talk about some more middle school trauma. We had a lot of that as it turns out. I'm excited.
Yeah. Are we doing that on the podcast?
I figure we talk about it off the podcast.
Oh, okay,
because
well,
it's not related
there
to
was
structure.
just a pause there, so I didn't know if you wanted me to wrap up the podcast so we could go do that, or if you wanted me to bring it up on the our trauma podcast.
That's its own whole podcast, my dude. We can't address the Maddox in passing.
No.
It's a whole...
Like we did.
But
we shouldn't have, because there's a lot to unpack there.
Well, if people want to know, they can mention it in the comments down below.
Nice.
I'm
gonna do that. So we can
wait a second.
Comment on our own video. Listen, I want to talk about this more.
We're gonna talk about more, but we're gonna turn off the podcast.
Bye, guys.
This has been Unsolicited Advice. I'm Bubblegum.
Bye, guys.
Yep, Cat's real good at the outro. Bye.